Coming back to the afternoon session. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. My name is Wangchuk Shakabpa. I'm with the U.S. Executive Board member of the U.S. Executive, and our organization is one of the co-organizers of today's conference. I'll be the moderator for the afternoon session. Just to give you an overview of what the afternoon session will be, we have two speakers for the afternoon session. Mullin, to my far left, will be talking first.
Applause, guys. Applause.
And Mullin will be talking about the 13th Dalai Lama's prophecy, subtext, maps to Ramzen, even at this late date. Not too late. And then he will be followed by our very esteemed Prof. Thurman, who will be talking about, I'm sure, a number of very interesting topics.
And of course, today that's the situation, isn't it? I mean, of course, a lot of Tibetans in America are working and aren't beggars, but as refugees, the society as a whole lives more on international aid or aid from sponsors and well-wishers than they do if they were living in their own country, maintaining their own situation. Now, the 13th Dalai Lama had a bigger issue too in his mind, I think. And for those of us involved in Tibet and involved in Central Asia, I like to use the expression Altai Himalaya, which was coined by that great Russian-born New York artist, Nicholas Reddick, who tried to get the Mongol regions and the Tibetans and the Ladakhis and the Bhutanese, Sikkimese, and all to join together and form one sort of great Central Asian nation. He did this when he went through Tibet in the mid-1920s, at the time of the formation of the League of Nations, and nobody was quite sure what a country was and wasn't. And so it was kind of his idea. But that vast territory all sees Tibetan culture as the root and heartland. And I think the great tragedy today and for our generation is that with Tibet gone, the culture in those vast regions is finished. Buddhism, the 15-year-old culture, 2,000-year-old culture of Ladakh will disappear in 100 years. The present highest Lama from Ladakh was trained in Tibet in the 1950s, again in Tifa. And similarly, all Bhutanese people all went to Tibet for their higher education. Northern Nepal for Sherpas, and Sikkimese, actually Tibetan called Trechon, which means rice land. I think Elliot asked the question this morning, what about Puchon? Does it have anyone ever seen that used as the name of a country? Well, yes, the country of Sikkim, rice country. I think Jong is kind of a Tibetan way of saying Stan, Uzbekistan. What was it that Borat made that movie about? Kazakhstan. And then if we go north of Tibet, across the Silk Road, Khotan and all those places were all Tibetan culture really since the time of Samsung Gangpo, from 650. For instance, when King Langdarma was assassinated, I think it was, 843? The assassin ran up first and hung out in Tsongkhapa's birthplace, and the two trees, or shoots from the two trees, still stand there. From that time, that place was part of Tibetan culture. He then went up to Mongolia, and the oldest Tibetan monastery was built by him near Har Haron, the old summer capital of Genghis Khan. Assassins chased him up there from Lhasa, because if you kill a king, you irritate people. So he ran up to Buryat and hid out in Buryat for a while. And the assassins followed him up there, but they fell in love and settled down, and he went back to Tibet. But since that time, from Siberia all the way down to Ladakh and Bhutan, Tibet has been the culture of that vast region, the Tibetan culture, the Tibetan language. And we shouldn't say Tibetan Buddhism. There's no word in the old Tibetan language for Tibetan Buddhism. It's just Namchu, something like that. Or they'll say Tekchen Yichu, or Doji Tekpa. They use words like that. They think of it as something very international. And many of the greatest students in the Tibetan monasteries weren't Tibetan. They were from Bhutan, Ladakh, at least. Even today, the head of the school is a Ladakhi. Well, 500 monks from Bhutan, 500 monks from Mongolia go and study in the refugee monasteries in India. So I think the 13th Dalai Lama's prophecy is important not just to Tibet. You know, it's not, Tibet isn't that important as an entity. I mean, it's a piece of grass, there's some beautiful mountains and so on and so forth. But as a spiritual and cultural entity, it's as big as North America, going from Siberia all the way down to Ladakh, little Spiti. So when we say Ramsen of Tibet, preservation of Tibet, as a national entity and a cultural entity, it involves not just the stability and future of Tibetans. Of course, Tibetans are nice people, they're beautiful people. Well, most Tibetan men are a little ugly, but the women... no, I shouldn't say that. The Tibetan men are probably stronger than me. Not when I was in my youth, but today. And so, we're not just talking about preserving, you know, the important issue isn't preserving Tibet just as preserving a culture in the sense of, you know, preserving Canada as an entity or New Zealand as an entity or something like that, which of course these people have the right to be an entity, but it's way beyond that in terms of cultural and spiritual stability and the future of this planet. The Dalai Lama often likes to point out our mountains are the highest in the world, and as a result our ecosystem is the most fragile in the world, similar almost to the North Pole in terms of fragility. And Tibetans, for thousands and thousands of years, maintained a kind of an eco-balance that benefited everyone. In the Chinese way of just, I know when I went to Tibet in the early 80s, if you put your hand through a river, you'd bump your hand into 5 or 6 fish, because only doctors would fish, because fish were only used for medicines, and otherwise they were more or less protected by law. Protected by law, not enforced, but enforced by honor code, you could say. And it was pretty much the same throughout Asia, throughout Tibet. Today, if you go to Tibet, you don't see a river where you don't have 3 or 4 Chinese guys standing there fishing away and not catching much, because they're mostly all dead. All the fish have been killed off. So it's not just Tibet as a country, but it's Tibet as this great cultural entity, which was larger than the Roman Empire at the time of the Roman Empire's height, in terms of a cultural entity, not a political entity. And the relationship between those countries, you know, naturally there are always little feuds here and there. Boys will be boys, kings will be kings. But for almost 1,500 years, a state of well-being, economic, and ecological harmony was established, and a great tradition of spirituality and enlightenment and culture. Jamyang Norbo pointed out this morning, you know, many people think of Tibet as these pictures of these kind of little farmers in the, you know, who don't take many baths, and it's true, Tibetans did think bathing was bad. And, you know, there was a national bath day every year, just in case you forgot. But in fact, the health benefits of less bathing have yet to be clinically studied. The Tibetans, as the Tucci said in Tibet, when he was brought into an argument with some aristocrats arguing over some modern scientific theory that the Tibetans didn't agree with, he said, well, the sort of validity of this Tibetan stance is very possibly going to be proven by future scientific studies. So just, I think I'll finish there, because I've got the very wonderful Bob Thurman standing beside me, whose oratorial skills far exceed my own. And I tried to make a couple of statements here to set him off a little bit. Bob and I have been friends since ancient times. As I said at Tibet House last year, and I remember the days when he and I could jump up Mount Everest in a single bound, wrestle the wild yak, and so forth. And it's always been a wonderful relationship. He's been so kind and generous to all of us, kind of what we call abajo. What's that Tibetan word? Abajo? Style writers and teachers for many years. We became very good friends when he was on sabbatical in India in the mid-70s, and we stayed since then. And then when I came over in the mid-80s, I brought over some groups of Tibetan Lamas. In 88, 89, I brought Losaling, was the third group I worked on. And I managed, through a connection, to get us a performance of Tibetan sacred music, sacred dance for world peace in the Doug Hammarskjöld Auditorium of the United Nations here in New York. And I had to sign a piece of paper saying I wouldn't say anything political about Tibet and wouldn't mention Ramsen and wouldn't mention the Dalai Lama, because otherwise the Chinese would veto us having it. So I thought, oh, that's okay, I can get away, I can live without saying that. So I invited Bob to come and do the interview. I didn't tell him the paper I had signed, saying that I wouldn't talk about it. My goodness, all three of those issues just happened to slip out. You see, we Irish know how to set up these little waspy titles. Thank you very much. Let's say something 3 times just for auspicious purposes. Hood yellow. Hood yellow. Hood yellow. Hood yellow. Hood yellow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Our next speaker probably needs no introduction, but Professor Thurman is a scholar, an author, and co-founder of our host, Tibet House. We're very fortunate that he's taking time out of his very busy schedule. He's speaking yesterday in upstate New York.
Which I
yesterday in upstate New York you were speaking?
Yeah, there was another thing at Bard College from another group.
So,
and then Dr. there, and Tendola was there.
So we're very fortunate to that he's graciously agreed to come here and speak. So without further ado, Professor.
Oh, okay. I guess I could have stand up too.
I stood up just to make you stand up.
For those who can't see the people. Hello, everybody. So I wanted Glenn to go first because he did make this wonderful book, The Path of the Bodhisattva Warrior, and this other wonderful book, you know, when he was younger and his brain still worked. And this wonderful book, The History of the Dalai Lama, both of which are really outstanding. I've been assigning them to my classes for my students for many years. And I haven't told anything about the personality of the author, just about what an excellent book it is. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the so-called Declaration of Independence. And I joined with Glenn's, all of his different quibbles about the different names. I think that's all very correct. It wasn't really a Declaration of Independence because they've been independent always. And actually, I consider them independent now. There's just some people like living on top of that, that's all. And an illegal annexation and occupation that began 50, 60 years ago. And nobody speaks about it because of the big habit of Western people of selling out Tibet out of a fantasy of getting something out of China. And one of the reasons and things I really want to talk about today is something I discovered in England in 1984. And I want a little bit rag on the Brits. I wanted, so if anybody is British here, like, do take offense. That's perfectly okay. And because this habit of selling out the Tibetans, I think really they began this habit. And they really started it 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And one thing I didn't even notice when I was looking this over and thinking about this talk, you mentioned that the great 13th Dalai Lama was born the year of the Chifu Convention, which was the year they gave away Tibet. I was just in Burma, actually, and I was reading from the U Thant's grandson the story of how the Brits tried to justify their ripping off Burma, coming over from India and taking, imprisoning the last king of Burma and sending him off to Mangalore to some bungalow somewhere in India and robbing all the resources of Burma. And they did it in order to win an election in London, usual thing. And then to do that, they sort of handed Tibet to the Chinese to not have them protest their grabbing of Burma. So it kind of all started really there, and it was very interesting. The Burmese, by the way, identify with the Tibetans very much, and the way they tell their own history, they talk about the Dali kingdom in Kham, and they talk about how that was a Tibeto-Burman kingdom, and the Burmese people, among the many ethnic groups that are composed Burma today, the Burma people, the Burmese people, consider themselves kind of bunch of combats who wanted to go to the beach and be at the lower altitude and live in the tropics, you know, basically, you know, not stay up at the high altitude. And so that's the it used to be the Tibeto-Burman language family, and then once the Chinese invaded, all the sycophantic professors who wanted the grovelers, what they call the grovelers for visas, the ones who grovel for visas to the Chinese Imperium, they changed it to Sino-Tibetan language family, or the Tibeto-Burman subgroup of the Sino-Tibetan language family. But really, Tibetan and Burmese are connected, not Chinese. Chinese has loan words in Tibetan, but not linguistic connection in the same way. So I completely agree that it isn't really a declaration of independence. When you look at the points in the Dalai Lama statement in 1913, when he had expelled the the last of the Manchu troops, and he was basically just saying that the patron-priest relationship is over with the Manchurians, nothing to do with the Chinese. I don't like calling them the Qing dynasty. That's one of my quibbles, my favorite. I never refer to the Qing dynasty or the Yuan dynasty. It's the Mongolian dynasty and the Manchu dynasty. When you say Qing and Yuan, it's like you're joining the Chinese pretense that they were Chinese, which they weren't. And they were being very nasty to the Chinese, actually, in both cases. And the Chinese were happy to get rid of them in 1911, and they, in getting people pumped up to rebel against the Manchus, they were talking about throwing out the foreign Manchus. Once they threw them out, when they wanted the Manchu land, they then started saying, oh, the Manchus are kind of Chinese. And that's, you know, like the Tibetans, the Mongolians, and the Uyghurs. You know, those are those four big minorities. The 4 stars on the Chinese flag. But no Chinese people know that. What those 4 stars on that ridiculous-looking flag, the red rag that they have. The big stars, the Chinese people, and the 4 other stars are the Manchu, Tibetan, Uyghur, and Mongolians. And they are not one of those stars really wants to be on that flag. They really like to get off. Just have the thing. And then even the expression, I don't like the expression Han Chinese, that's a stupid expression invented by the nationalists. When the Chinese Revolution was actually overthrown right away, when they killed the real revolutionaries and some general took over, former Manchu general. And, you know, where they started going, well, they're all Chinese, because we want to, everywhere the Manchu Imperium had some relationship, we want that to be China. So they're all Chinese. So we have Tibetan Chinese, Manchu Chinese, Mongolian Chinese, and Uyghur Chinese. And then we have Chinese Chinese. Oh, that doesn't sound good. That's a little embarrassing. Chinese Chinese? Why don't we say that? Oh, well, let's take the name of an old dynasty and call them Han Chinese. It's ridiculous, really. It's just silly. It's like the concept of a multinational nation. What does that mean? It's just completely asinine. So anyway, but in his so I agree with that. But on the other hand, it's good in a way to, another thing I quibble about and I don't like, is March 10th being referred to as Tibetan Independence Day. I don't like that, because that, and then talk about or rebellion or uprising. Because the uprising conveys to people who don't know the story as if, oh, the Chinese were there in some legal way or some real way, and then they uprose against them. It was like an abortive uprising, you know, right? You know what I mean? Like the Chinese really were there. Whereas it was just a momentary resistance which had been ongoing from the beginning. And so Independence Day really should be February 13th. I really think we should make that more of a thing. We should do that every year. Jamila can come to New York and he can, like, his moustache will be growing more. Pump us up on the independence movement. That would be very good. And it should be every February 13th, and March 10th should be seen as the Lhasa Massacre Day, and a day of national mourning, actually, rather than that's the Freedom Day, because in fact that one failed. But the December 13th one succeeded. And he did make a proclamation about what Tibet should be like, but he doesn't say, he says, as now we're going to have a time of happiness and peace, is what he says. He doesn't say we're now having a time of independence, because as Glenn rightly said, they've always been independent. And actually they remain independent now. They just have people like living in there, like the squatters are living in their living room, you know. And they won't last there because they can't. Because it's the altitude is too high. When I was working on my Why the Dalai Lama Matters book, I was delighted to discover some Chinese scientists working with Finnish, I think, and Swedish scientists, and then some Americans, discovered that those who are born at low altitude, who try to live year-round in Tibet, get CMS. once I heard they had an acronym for it, I knew it was a real thing. And CMS means chronic mountain sickness. And one chamber of the heart becomes distended and distorted, and they're in great danger of heart attack. And Chinese women miscarry, mostly, because they can't build up the placenta with the low level of 45% of the oxygen. And that is the explanation of why Tibet was independent all this time. I had the eureka moment myself in 1993 when I drove, after taking a tour in central Tibet, I somehow got a permission and I drove from, with two friends, from Chengdu to Xining. And I drove up the whole eastern border, you know, the 13th Dalai Lama's eastern border. And when you drive up that border, in those days, I don't know what, there's more Chinese people squatting there now, I know. But in those days, there weren't too many. But anyway, everywhere where you would see up over the 11,000 foot mark, up over the headwaters of the valleys, that were the rivery valleys that were going, you would see some places where they tried to plow or they were trying to settle in the Chinese way of living, and they created a desert. It was a complete disaster. And even in the headwaters of the river where they clear-cut the trees and they'd done some weird mining things and there was like white chemical stuff all over the place, they just made a mess. And basically you could see they could not take, there's no subsistence livelihood for Chinese type of people in Tibet, basically. And therefore, the Chinese never lived there for thousands of years, and in fact they never will live there for the next few thousand years. Because the one thing they cannot import, even with modern technology, is more oxygen. They could put a giant dome, I guess, over all of Tibet and then pump in oxygen, and then the Chinese could go live there and grow rice and not hurt animals like they don't do, and use human shit for fertilizer and be happy and have rice and maybe plant some oysters in the lake. So they have seafood, you know, because they like seafood. Otherwise, they're never going to live there. It's just a joke. It's Deng Xiaoping in his ossifying old age, freaked out by the Soviet Union collapsing and giving back Kazakhstan to the Kazakhs, and Ukraine to the Ukrainians, and the Baltic states to the Baltics, and realizing he would have to do that someday, so desperately make a railroad, send the people up there. He couldn't go breathe up there himself. And actually, Hu Jintao, I was also surprised and delighted to know when I wrote that book, that Hu Jintao very rarely spent time in Tibet when he was the party boss in Tibet in the late 80s, because he had altitude sickness all the time when he went there. He had headaches, he didn't sleep, he couldn't eat. So he really ruled it from Beijing and was very rarely there for any more than a few days at a time. So he should have known better than to try to pretend that they were going to colonize successfully Tibet. They never will. They were going to make a huge mess before they quit. Of course, they've already made a big mess. And that's a big problem, not just for the Tibetans, that's a real problem for the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Laotians, the Burmese, the Thais, the Indians, the Bengalis. It's a big problem for all of them because all their rivers are being ruined. And also the Chinese people, their rivers come up there, and they're really ruining the highland, the water tower region. So that's all good. And I don't think there should be a problem about having an Independence Day, because even the middle way thing, which I will still defend as a good thing rather than just some lawyer says, I don't know that story about a bunch of lawyers. There's some lawyers up there.
For the first time
You're not allowed to. You should have.
You're bringing inside story.
Can't throw it, my turn. There's some lawyers creeping over there from California.
You got it.
That's Canadian California envy. Just forget it. There's no lawyer. The middle way is His Holiness's very intelligent thing to do in terms of trying to work something out and getting international support for the Tibetan cause, which he has extremely successfully done. But the problem is that the nations of the world today, because of technology and things, are no longer democratic, including the US, is plutocratic, and therefore the will of the people who would like to see Tibet free and are not into having China conquer the world, as the Chinese want to do, they do not get their governments to do what they want. Sometimes they get the parliaments to make resolutions about Tibet, but the executive branches of all these governments don't, because the business people continue the policy that the British started of selling out Tibet with the fantasy of getting some relationship to China. And they've really done really well. Everybody who's had a good relationship with China has a huge trade deficit, They have been hacked to death, where the Chinese can turn the electric lights on and off if they want by their hackers. And probably the nuclear weapons won't work. If they try to fire them at the Chinese, they probably come back and hit them in Kansas. Because the Chinese hackers have reprogrammed them. So in fact, they've got no benefit out of their groveling to the Chinese. And they've endangered everyone in all of these countries by not listening to His Holiness the Dalai Lama about what is the actual real danger, the last remaining major danger before we have a peaceful planetary society, which would be the Chinese attempting to conquer the world militarily as well as economically. And recognizing that what they've been doing in the last 30 years is not becoming modern and capitalist and happy, and that they've been engaged in economic warfare, which they have been winning because of the greed and stupidity of the rest of us. So that's my current view of that. So the middle way is a very intelligent way of trying to regain independence, and virtual independence for the moment, and then when the Chinese really realize the impossibility of colonizing Tibet, when they finally listen to their scientists and their doctors and their environmentalists, then the Chinese colonists and the annexers will leave. And then, whatever you call it, it will gradually do like that. So I consider it still a proper and intelligent policy. Of course, it's based on the view, though, why this Independence Day celebration is a good thing. It's based on the fact that there is a real independence. And it's a matter of conceding some paperwork for the time being, rather than giving up that, because remember Jiang Zemin, when Clinton got Jiang Zemin to say, well, we might talk to the Dalai Lama, if he says not only that he's willing to join the Chinese Union, but also that they've always been part of China. Remember that? Yeah, that's what Dalai Lama had to say. And of course, he'll never say that, because that would be untrue. And Avalokiteshvara is not supposed to lie, and he never will. And of course, they've never been part of China, and they're still not part of China. They're just some squatters living there. That's why you have to realize that. So don't feel insecure about it. So that's the thing. Now, however, one thing that you political guys have to bear in mind, the statement in the Declaration of the Dalai Lama, as on that wall there, is the first point in his different points of the statement, at least in the translation where they're numbered. Well, the very first point, of course, is that the priest-patron relationship has faded like a rainbow in the sky. So I'm not talking to the Manchus anymore. And no question of the Chinese. We never talk to the Chinese. They never had a foot in Tibet. But the Manchus, that's like the Mongols, they're a little tougher, and we used to have a thing with them, but we don't do that anymore. So that's the first point. Second point, and he makes that, and he talks about he doesn't say now we're going to have independence, because he always had it, like you say. Right? Buddhism is made bread to life. I'm sure Jamir Buddha Dharma that. And living in Buddha's life. Now we have a time of happy. He doesn't say the first thing is to be red-blooded Tibetan. It's Buddhism is the first thing he mentions. Second thing he mentions is that the Buddhist sects should not squabble with each other. There is one thing which was in a famous revelation given to Tsongkhapa by the incarnation of Vajrapani, Lotakampa Gyaltsen, in the thing where he mentioned that Vajrapani predicted a time when Tibet would be invaded, and the deities of the outside people around Tibet would come in and take over the center, and that the lamas and the future generation of the lamas would be ejected to the outside. But the cause of that, Vajrapani said in that ancient prophecy, dating from around 1398, 1399, was the different Tibetan sects fighting with each other and getting their protectors to make war on each other. That was the cause. And then when they were out in exile, the way in which they would return would be when those sects would really come together again and stop quarreling with each other. And that was in that prophecy. I asked His Holiness once if that's what he was thinking about in putting down the cult that is the most intolerant among the Gelupas, and starting this other real problem that we've been having lately by dissociating. He didn't ban because he had no power to ban, but dissociating himself from the Shukde cult. And he said, no, what prophecy? I wasn't thinking of that. He denied that he was doing that, because that's a way of trying to make connection. That particular cult was intolerant of the non-Gelupa orders, and therefore he dissociated himself from that very wisely, although it's causing a lot of problems in other ways. And so the second point he made is the sect should be harmonious and not do that. And the third point he said is that the officials, the kujaks and the government officials, they should behave themselves, and they should not be corrupt and screw over the people when they're, especially in Eastern Tibet or far away, and they should do, and they should give up some of the more forceful, fierce punishment things like amputations and things like that, which I'm sure you talked about this morning, Camilla, which would date back from the Mongol law, of the Kublai Khan time, the very rough law of that ancient period, and was still going on somewhat in those days. And then he talks about how the fourth point was defend the borders and the invaders. This is the difference. You're talking about the later when you say prophecy, right? This is the 1913 one. And he says we should defend our borders against invaders because we have a resource-rich country, and invaders will come in and try to take our resources. He said that already in 1913. So that's because he was trying to form an army at that time. And then finally, he gives a wonderful thing. He gives what's called a jubilee. He basically gives a jubilee where he says he wants uncultivated land to be free to the cultivator. And it should be owned by anybody who cultivates it, and people who say, I own it and I'm not cultivating, but you can't go on it, to another person should be blocked by the government. And so it's kind of like a distribution of land kind of point that he puts in his fifth point. And so that was his declaration of the time of happiness and prosperity at that time, which I think we can, although the term is incorrect in a way, you're right, but still it should be independence, and therefore we should start a tradition of Independence Day in Tibet being February 13th, the first Independence Day, and the second one is the day when it's in the next 5 years, within the next 5 or 6 years, I believe, before 2019, which is the next pig year, and which will be a really bad year if something special isn't done. Then we have to see His Holiness back in Tibet. We have to see them make a different document and Tibet become virtually free, whatever the actual physical arrangement is. I think within 6 years we have to see that happen, within His Holiness's lifetime, and I believe we will personally. But I know people think my own family knows that I'm a little wacky, so you all could be forgiven if you don't agree. It's very hard emotionally for us to think that some wonderful change like that could happen. And I always resort to end of apartheid and Soviet Union walking out of Eastern Europe as saying that any of these supposedly impossible things actually can happen. And the supposed realpolitikers and all the wise men, they say, oh, this never happened, big Paul, never do that, and they did it. And this can also happen. And whatever the paperwork to save face might be there for the time being, that's another matter. So those are the things. Now I want to go back to the evil Brits. Now, nowadays you hear in diplomatic terms, that's really what I want to say today mainly. I don't want to go over all the things that you have more ably done than me. But the Brits are really a pain. You mentioned even how they gave away Tibet 3 times in your book here, very nicely. The Chifu Convention is the first, then there was the Anglo-Russian Convention that they did after they invaded, and then the third one I forgot, but some other crappy thing where they just handed over Tibet. And I have to confess a guilt here. I feel a great guilt about it, and one of you may be able to help me with it. Many years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago, a woman who I don't even know, I don't remember her name, I don't know if she's still alive, an Australian woman, wrote a doctoral dissertation for, I believe, Canberra, the Australian National University. And I don't remember who was her mentor, academic mentor. And that doctoral dissertation documented the process in the British government about Tibet from 1904, before 1904 actually, the whole process of how they kept selling out Tibet. And she showed with memos and all sorts of things very brilliantly how the Raj people would constantly push to have Tibet recognized by the world as a free country, as an independent country, to keep it as a buffer zone between the Raj and any future Chinese imperium, the Manchu one or the nationalist one or any future one. Because the Raj people knew that it would be very bad for India to have China controlling the highland in Tibet. They knew that. And they would put different memos and plans and things into Whitehall. And then the Hong Kong British would get over there, the Taipans, and they would undo that, and they would say, to hell with it, don't do it, and they would use whatever corruption they could or whatever influence they had to block that thing, and then the Whitehall would drop it and wouldn't do it. And this is a long, again and again process, and she wrote this great thing. She couldn't get a publisher, and she showed it to me, and she gave me a copy, actually, but I didn't have any way of publishing myself, so it was in a shelf, and 3 or 4 apartment moves later, decades later, I can't find it. I don't remember her name or what, but that would be a very valuable book, and I would publish it today from Tibet House. I would have the means to do that. I would love to do it, but I can't remember the name, I can't find the book, and I can't remember the woman's name. If anybody, we have some Australians here, I know. If anybody knows of that thing, from some other channel, I would be very grateful to know about it, because I really think the world should see it. And then I will relate last my personal experience. I was, in 1984, I was with His Holiness's entourage in London when he had a visit there, and I managed to evade the bodyguards and everybody, and I got on the trip to the British East India Library at the Embankment, and I don't know if it's even still there, but it's an institution they had, where they had a collection of stuff having to do with the Raj. And a lady, a very wonderful lady, who I don't know if she's alive either, Mrs. Commander, whose husband had been an important diplomat, who was an Anglo-Indian lady, she had made an exhibit of things to show His Holiness when he came there, and a few people like me in entourage. And we went around, and then I completely freaked out because I saw in a case a letter, and I remember only this about it. I didn't have an iPhone at the time, or I would have a picture. It was signed by Winston Churchill in 1923. He was already functioning, I guess, in Whitehall. And it was dated 1923, I remember that much. And I do not remember whether it was to Sir Charles Bell or whether it was to the current Governor General of India, but one of the two. And in it, basically, Churchill was giving the how are we going to sell out Tibet theory. And the theory that he said, and I read it in a good hand, good British hand, he said, we know Tibet is an independent country. And China has no rule there. We had to get in there. We made our own deals with them. We know that. And we know that they therefore deserve to be known by the world as an independent country. But there's nothing in it for us to do that. I know you're worried there in India that if some other big power came in to Tibet, it would be bad for India, for the Raj. But we don't really have to worry about that because nobody will really get in there. It's so difficult and so inaccessible and so high and blah, blah, blah. And the Chinese haven't got their act together to do it, but at least the fact that we act like they're sort of having the suzerainty or whatever, I don't remember if he used that word, whatever he said, keeps the Russians out, so they're all messed up now with communism. We don't need to worry about it. No one will ever go there anyway. So we have no stake and we have no benefit by promoting the recognition of Tibet. We can just keep it a backward buffer state as it is, and our business people in Hong Kong and Guangdong get benefit by letting the Chinese say, we're letting you have Tibet. And so we're making business with this, and that we do have a motive to do, and the Chinese like the idea when we say, yes, you can have Tibet. So it's not in our economic interest, and we don't need to do it for geopolitical reasons. So sell it out, and stop Bell, or to Bell, stop yourself from any encouragement of the Dalai Lama, that was the 13th at that time, of that he's going to get to be announced to the world as having his own country. I swear it said that. So I called over his phone saying, Your Holiness, come and look. Winston Churchill's selling out Tibet. I'm all excited. And His Holiness comes over, and he's like another, looking at somebody else over there. He doesn't like those exempt tours anyway, because they're all his own documents, and he'd like to know that. He doesn't like museums, because museums are for dead people, dead cultures, it's not dead, and will never be. And so he comes over and he looks down at it, and he sees like a little bit, just for a very short second, doesn't really read it. He looks at me and he says, because I was saying, look. He looks at me and he says, you look. It's that. So then that's why I finally wrote that book, Why the Dalai Lama Matters, a little bit of political thinking. Normally I'm always doing Buddhism. But I felt like I was looking at it. But then, this is where now, Elliot Sperling and others, I would like you to know about this. Because since then, different sort of scholarly people and even some wealthy business people who sort of go around London and have connections there, I said, please go there and find and get a copy of that letter. And they deny that it exists. To several different people that I've sent there. I didn't try to go myself. Because I'm not a historian, I don't really do that kind of research, but I asked several people, please find that letter. And whoever runs that library, I guess it's been put in a safe or somewhere, they don't want the embarrassment of that being a plain statement of their bullshit policy. Excuse my language. But it is. And, you know, when they say it, the Americans even say, no big power ever recognized Tibet. That is a lie. The Simla Convention is a recognition of Tibet. It's a tripartite conference between nationalist China, Tibet, and Great Britain, the Empire, British Empire. And it even said those, and all three plenipotentiaries initialed it. And there was a provision of it that any one of those countries that didn't ratify what the plenipotentiary initiated would not have the benefits of that thing, indicating that they were treated as three different entities. And so that is a recognition. So Tibet was recognized, actually, by the British themselves as a separate entity from, at that time, that was nationalist, just sort of beginning nationalist China. And so, you know, they can say, well, there was a convention, well, we only wanted Arunachal Pradesh. We wanted them, you know, we wanted to draw the McMahon line to include Arunachal Pradesh. Oh, well, we didn't think it would really be bad for anybody. Oh, we really were worrying about China more than Tibet. They can say anything they want. The point is, the true fact is they were recognizing the Tibetan government as its own government. And another question I have for you historians like Elliot, because I was rereading your account of it again, and the Tibetans brought this huge bunch of documents to that Simla. Did they give those documents to the Brits? And if so, where are they? If they gave them, they might be preserved somewhere. And if they took them back to Tibet, then it's really, the Chinese will not let anybody see them, I'm sure. But what were all the documents in which they made their case about their freedom? That's a very important point. Where are they? Do you know, Elliot, yourself?
There are a lot of documents in the private office, which the private office in Dharamsala refused to release until...
They're in Lhasa, you think?
No, in Dharamsala.
Oh, they're in Dharamsala, all those documents?
Yeah, and they weren't releasing them.
They came to India, so the British kept them in India, and then, okay, well that's interesting to know, because that's a bunch of proofs about the independence of Tibet that they presented to the British that were very, very convincing in 1914, so in the Simla Convention. So just anybody tells you, oh, nobody ever, if you have a, you know, cocktail conversation with anybody, and they go on and on about Tibet is the great lost cause and nobody ever recognized Tibet, I mean, that's a lie. And then the other thing is, Lama, I believe, the 13th Dalai Lama, nevertheless, in spite of Charles Bell, in spite of the British blockade, he did send, I believe it was Lama, who was a very youthful-looking Kujat minister, some kind of like, official. And he sent him with the boys that he sent to Eton, in England, because he looked like a teenager, like a young guy. You know, he had no facial hair, and he was little. And then he put shorts on him, and they sent him in to be a student. And then he kept trying to sneak over to Geneva to present credentials to the League of Nations. And the Brits, this MI6 or James Bond, kept catching him and dragging him back to the prep school where he had been sent. And several times he tried to do that, but he failed. So 13th Dalai Lama knew what it meant to get the world's recognition, but he was unable to do it by the perfidy of the Brits, is what I'm saying. And they still are at it, the Brits, I must say. And they act like nobody knows and resist and that. And I find them very irritating, personally, on this topic. And they should really own up to their selling it down Tibet. And the Americans inherited that from them. In the 1950s thing, when they first invaded 51, when they went to the UN, the Brits first, the guy, the British ambassador, said, okay, yeah, that's bad, they invaded Tibet. And then he got instructions from London, and he said, well, nobody really knows. The Taiwanese were saying it's an internal affair. What is it, we don't know, and they act like they don't know. And then Nehru took that cue, he didn't know, nobody knew, but they perfectly knew. Bunch of diplomatic liars. And that should be out there. We should all be aware of that. We should argue it, we should say it, we should... Elliot Sperling's going to write a book about it. Come on, stop trying to be nice to them, Elliot. Do it. You live in Indiana, you don't care about the Brits. Get out. Get out. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. And I want anyone who has contacts in England and who knows people and who might be able to get that letter, it would be really, really precious. That would be worth an entire book from one of these historians. If they can find Winston, the great Winston Churchill, in his colonial realpolitik, you know, his proto-Kissingerian behavior. In 1923, it really is really something wonderful. And I'm sure about those facts about it. I can't remember, unfortunately, other things about it. I couldn't take a picture of it, and now they pretend they don't have it. But it's really a valuable document for our movement. Okay? Thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you, Ghana. So now we're gonna have a time that people in the audience can ask questions of Glenn and Thurman, and then we'll have a short period of time where you can also ask questions that you didn't get a chance to ask Professor Sperlin and Jamin Murula. They're still in the audience. One thing I know that both our speakers addressed the issue of Rangzen and Middle Way. Well, I'm going to ask that, this is not a conference about Middle Way versus Rangzen, which is better, which is worse. So to the extent that you can, try to keep the issues more onto the topic of history, why the history matters is fine. That's fine. And in fact, I'll start it off with, I'll be the bad lawyer, and I'll be the devil's advocate here. And I'll ask this question of both of you. If I'm China, let's take everything that Tibet says is true. Tibet was independent from 1930 to 1950. It lost that independence because the People's Liberation Army invaded. Yeah. And since then, at least since 1951, the 17-point agreement, Tibet has been ruled by the People's Republic. Okay. Let's accept the Tibetan version of history. Why does it matter? That history, why does it matter today? Lots of countries lost their independence to invasion. Half the Western United States is U.S. because we invaded Mexico and just took the land. No one is saying, well, that's not legitimate in the United States anymore. California is not part of the United States anymore. So why it's been 60 years of Chinese rule, clearly Tibet has not been independent since 51. Why today, even believing everything Tibetans are saying about their history, why does it still matter today?
Okay, shall I go first?
If you're brave enough.
Yeah, I'm going the answer to that is, and this is one of the problems why the Chinese are genociding the Tibetans, actually. The answer to that is the Chinese know that with the founding of the UN, with the aim of not having any more world wars, borders that existed in 1947 with the founding of the UN are sacrosanct in international law, although international law is not well enforced, of course everybody knows that. But therefore, any invasion and annexation done since 1947 has a very different status than different kinds of invasions and colonialisms done before. And the Chinese pretense, of course, is that they're liberating somebody. They won't admit to that they are being colonized. And so they want to, that's why to them it's so important that the Dalai Lama has to say, if they want to talk to him, oh, we always were part of China, because they don't want to be accused of having that not being an internal affair, that invasion. If that invasion is not an internal affair, then their status in Tibet is just as weak, or actually weaker, than Saddam Hussein's status in Kuwait. And he was thrown out of Kuwait on the basis that the border drawn in 1947, of course, drawn by a bunch of British colonialists who were two different Arab tribes, which is, they're more sane, actually the same language, everything than the Chinese and the Tibetans are. But nevertheless, in the international order, the UN, New World Order of the UN means that you can't invade after that time, and the victor cannot keep the spoil. The two people who are really upset about this are the Chinese and the Israelis, because they want to keep their West Bank and they want to keep their Tibet. So it's nothing personal. They have to genocide the people on there, so nobody will be there to say no. And they hope to say, they say to us, some British guy said to me just the other day in Norway in a conference, just on the side of the conference, it wasn't about Tibet, but he said, actually more dangerously, he said to my wife, which was a big mistake, he said, oh, you killed your Indians, you're not going to go back to India, so why should China leave? Get rid of the Tibet, what does it matter? So he was in deep trouble, that that British guy, about saying that. But the point is, it's a century later, it's different, Yes, herding the Tibetan nomads into those camps in Yushu, and these places, what they call Yushu, in the eastern Tibet, and taking away their yaks. That's like the Americans shooting buffalo and putting the Indians on reservation. But actually, the Indians are still there. They still have treaties that we own a lot of gold from the Black Hills and this and that. And someday there will be some reckoning of all of that. There will. And the Chinese who say that to us, they're freaked out when we say we don't agree with our government on their behavior with the Indians, which they still do. So that's the reason why this matters, and that's the reason why they say Dalai Lama has to say always belong to China. He can't just say, now we'll maybe think about it, being some sort of autonomous relationship to you. He can't. That doesn't do any good, because that leads to independence, because the historical reality of independence is there. So, and as far as the conflict or debate between Middle Way and Rangzen, that's no debate. The Dalai Lama said, I pointed out to one Chinese professor up in Harvard yesterday, Staten Island is seeking independence from New York. And I hope they get it. There's no problem. Self-determination for Staten Island. And the Tibetan community in Jackson Heights, you can have independence from that. No problem. But the point is that the fact that everybody wants to be free, that's correct. Then everyone interconnects in EUs and common markets and trade agreements and things like that. That happens too. But the historical basis, the reality basis is Tibetans are different people, they have a different culture, they have a different language, they have their own territory, which is very easily demarcated, and it is not the TAR, it is what I call the BAR. I want the BAR. In my book I put that. The Bird Autonomous Region. They call themselves Myanmar down there, even though it's those weird generals. But nevertheless, the Burmese don't like to be Burmese, they're the Myanmarese now. And the Tibetans are Bird. You guys are Buddhas. Tibetans. Tibetans is some sort of Anglo mispronunciation of some Arabic thing about Tibet. And you're not all Tibets. You're from Lhasa, you're from Kham, from Ando. You're Tibets. And it should be called Bud. I don't care if that's when people have trouble pronouncing it. If they don't like umlauts. And so the BAR, that's what I want, the Bud Autonomous Region, including every single Tibet Autonomous Prefecture and county in all those states that they sneakily, they put those into those states. The Tibet Autonomous Prefecture of Sichuan, Yunnan, Gansu, and Qinghai. They did that because they didn't think that Nehru would be so stupid as to let them into central Tibet. They didn't think the UN would be so stupid as to let them just walk all over all of Tibet. Because but they learned how stupid the people were, and they learned that. So that's my answer to why it matters. Your turn.
I just wanted to put very briefly, I think the main reason it matters, and Bob pointed it out in between what he's saying, is that China does not say we invaded Tibet.
Exactly.
They say we always own Tibet. And if you ever mention to China, when I said I'm going to Tibet, and someone in Beijing said to me, well, we've done a good job up there, and blah, blah, blah. He said, yeah, not that many people died since the invasion and the Cultural Revolution. He said, oh, you can't say invasion. China never says we invaded Tibet. They do not accept we invaded Tibet. They insist all the time that it is we peacefully liberated Tibet and reunited it to the motherland. And this is an extremely important point, I think, because it gives Tibet both the legal stance and the moral high ground. Now, legal doesn't always work out, and moral high ground doesn't work out, but it is at least, as Clint Eastwood says, gives you an edge.
Right. I want to say one other thing. For example, Tibet House. They hate Tibet House. The Chinese hate it. Just the other day, one of our board members was denied a visa to Beijing, not going to Tibet, and they showed a picture of her standing nearby the Dalai Lama and said, is this you? Said, yes. You remember Tibet House? Yes. Bam! You can't have a visa. They hate us. Why? Because we say Tibet. Some other people say Himalayan art. Himalayan culture. That's what they say in Asian society. Himalayan. That's such bullshit. Himalayan, that's like saying French art is Alpine art. Because there are two Alps on one side of France. That's just complete catering. That's more groveling for visa. It'll never get them anywhere. That's good. This is Tibetan art. This is Tibet House. There's a Tibet House in New Delhi. It's not Himalayan House. That's a bunch of crap. And so the cultural thing is a very important part of maintaining awareness in the world's mind of Tibet as a distinctive thing. Because to make the Chinese finally calculate that the genocide will not pay off and they will not get away with it, and so they might as well look at reality, look at truth from facts. That's very important. So don't think that this cultural thing, you hardcore political people and you Dharma fanatics, don't think that the cultural thing is not important. It is very important. And that's why they hate us. One time when we had real trouble getting our exhibits into museums at the time when we still could. Nowadays we can't really get them in because the Chinese are there in every museum in the US. They're on the board, some wealthy Chinese person, they say, oh no, we don't need another Tibetan show, they go like that. and in other countries too, so it's very difficult to do a big show like that. They now occasionally send some stuff from their captive but it's very difficult. But the time we did, they had so many years to get all the venues lined up, sponsors, they just stop that show, because they don't want Tibet to be known to the public as its own thing. And the one thing nobody can deny is that Tibetan culture is distinct from Chinese culture. Their art is distinct, their form of Buddhism is distinct, and their diet is distinct, everything is distinct. Okay, I just want to say that.
Thank you.
A little bit of fluff.
Question was that why does Tibet is different than other situations? I have a feeling, of course it is about culture, but what it is the reincarnation idea of Tibetan Buddhist people getting next generation somehow not being, it's like this. I was in Taiwan, which is right at the border of China and India. Here is the orphanage, it's called Manjusri Project, and I'm helping them. These kids, 3 years old, already knows compassion. And I told the head monk, why do you teach already compassion or think for others before yourself? And they said, no, I haven't taught them. They don't know it yet, but they are born with it. And this is what I think that it is important. That's why Mozart was born. Before he was taught anything, he started writing music in 5 years old, or 3 years old, whatever it was. And then this is the only country in the whole world, I think, that this business of compassion or reincarnation is naturally born with these children. And this is why I think that it is important, so different than other. And culture, of course it's culture different, but that comes from the very newborn children. And right now, I was told in China, they take the 3-5 years old to the orphanage, to another Chinese school, and they teach only Chinese. And then they are not taught Tibetan language at all. And then they are very little time with parents. So this is really the core that small children is losing. And this is why it's so sad that I think we have to do something about this education.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're taking questions from any of the panelists that are about any topics that they spoke about today, or about the topics that we're talking about today, which is the independent Tibet, 1913 to 1915, the Proclamation of the Dalai Lama. Got a lot of questions this morning, and no questions. Or anybody want to make any comment about that period, or what has been spoken to by the panelists today? Oh, get a question.
So, Professor, you mentioned earlier that in the last 1,000 years, Chinese have not settled in Tibet because it's geographically isolated and it's high altitude and a lot of logistical issues. So, in the next 1,000 years, you mentioned that Chinese will not be able to, settle in Tibet. They will eventually have to leave. So, do we have any evidence that the Chinese moving and settling into Tibet now will some point in the future leave because there's no support from the government or no infrastructure tutorial?
Well, they say that if a Chinese man can marry a Tibetan woman, there's some chance that they can genetically kind of take within the high altitude of their offspring. But that's what their own scientists say. The Tibetan people have a special body chemistry, according to those scientific studies, where the lungs produce nitric oxide. I was very disappointed to learn that because I was hoping that it would be nitrous oxide, meaning that they'd all be laughing more. But nitric oxide apparently doesn't make you laugh more, so you can have many serious Tibetans. But nitric oxide somehow spreads the oxygen, the low level of oxygen, to the extremity. And according to this scientific report, even the Peruvians and the Bolivians do not have that particular genetic adaptation. And they do not think that in one generation, and therefore the Chinese who go there for tourist business and other things, they go back down below for many months. When the Chinese official's wife becomes pregnant, they send her down to Chengdu or Xining or somewhere, or their home original place in Fujian or wherever they came from, and she has her pregnancy there. So they themselves are aware that the people actually have to go there on the government orders, or because of subsidies, or because of quadruple salaries, or all the inducements that Deng Xiaoping instituted to move them up there. So that I believe the statement he made, and I'm sorry I can't remember where I heard that, but the statement he made that if China ever had to do a perestroika, a reconstructing like Russia did, the Soviet Union did, he wanted Tibet to be like Estonia and not like Lithuania. I heard that this statement was made. And Estonia, as you know, is majority Russian and not Estonian, and the others are majority Lithuanians and Latvians. So that, you know, otherwise Mao, remember in the 1950s, he said he would have 100 million Chinese in Tibet within 10 years, he said. But the reason he did it, he had a lot of extra Chinese. You know, and he wanted to shut down all the big cities, you know, where they had, you know, like, it was, you know, rural, whatever, communist, and move people out. And he, of course, it never worked because they can't live up there. Not possible. So I believe that is the case. They will leave when they've wrecked the place, you know, and we want them to leave sooner if possible.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think my wonderful, wonderful friend Bob Thurman suffers from a disorder I call optimismitis.
What do you say?
Optimismitis. I think there is a big problem. I think the biggest problem facing Tibet is immigration. Every time I go there, there's at least another 100,000 or 100. When I used to try to go twice a year, 100 to 150,000 extra immigrants, not sent in by the Chinese government, but mostly Muslim immigrants from Xinjiang, Sichuan, Qinghai, because under the Cultural Revolution, when people could only have one baby, those governments were a little bit nervous about imposing that rule in those areas. And as a result, many of those families had a farm smaller than this room, and would have 5, 6, 7 kids, and they give one of them a ticket to Tibet, and then he sets up a little tea stall, and 6 months later brings in one more, and 6 months later brings in one more. And as a result, the biggest single issue facing Tibetans really, I think, is immigration. And it would be wonderful if they all died as a lack of nitrous oxide, natural deaths, non-violent deaths. But unfortunately, I think that idea would be driven by the disorder I call optimismitis. I think the Tibetans have to push that issue very, very strongly and very, very quickly. And perhaps Jamyang has some ideas on it, but I don't think Dharamsala does, because Dharamsala is trying to avoid being controversial, being in India, lobbying with international governments and so forth. I think it has to be an outside kind of force which pushes issues like that.
You can say that, but the point is, what you have to acknowledge if you're going to seek truth from fact is that Tibet is about 1 million square miles, the highland, the plateau. It's about 1 million square miles. And the Chinese have had hundreds of millions of people for over 1,000 years. And extra people. You know, they occasionally used to have famines. In Mao's time, they had famines, and 20, 30 million died. And if Tibet had a subsistence livelihood possibility for many millions of people, why on earth weren't they there hundreds of years ago? Only 5, 6 million Tibetans could not have resisted such an immigration. Not possible. The point is they weren't there because they can't live there. That's the saving grace for Tibet, actually, is the land itself. It doesn't accept. It won't accept a bunch of Canadians either, or Americans. It's for the Buddhas. They're not even Tibetans, they're Buddhas. That's what they are.
Thank you. Tendala, we're live streaming through webcasting this conference at our Any relevant questions from our internet audience?
Oh, good. I'll collect a couple. Okay.
There is one that I saw that I'll modify a little bit to make it more contextual. The question is for the internet about U.S. aid to Tibet. It's more talking present, but I'm talking more historical. So we talk a lot about the British relationship and the Chinese relationship with Tibet in this time period. What's anything significant about the U.S. contacts with Tibet, if any, or to the extent that, or relationship? I know the U.S. government obviously never formally recognized Tibet as a separate state, but obviously it did have contacts, particularly during World War II. What can we say about the U.S. Connections to Tibet pre-1950?
I can address that first.
I think whereas optimism-itis is one problem, another problem is often deferring. And I think America did that in terms of the relationship with Tibet. America's foreign policy to Tibet was probably formed in 1888, when I think it was the then ambassador Rockhill, 1888, said we should follow the British policy on Tibet. And so this is 12 years after the Chifu Convention, which essentially Britain and the Manchus agreed that England could invade Burma and Thailand, and Manchus would have a free reign in Tibet. It was kind of a bipartisan agreement to which neither Tibet nor Burma nor Thailand were invited to cast their opinions. So Rockhill in 1888 essentially recommended to Washington to follow the British lead on that. And so from that time, America never really bothered going anywhere else or looking anywhere else. Their main trading partners then were China, Japan. World War II, China was their ally against Japan, so not much happened. After World War II, when the the delegation, and Jamyang, I'm sure knows more on that than either of us, but when the delegation sent by the Tibetan government in 1949 went to Delhi and then to London and then to Washington to seek aid, America said, we'll do whatever London decides to do. It's their sphere of interest, and so we will follow whatever they say. Had London said Tibet is independent, it's doubtful China ever would have invaded, because they came to the border and they paused and they waited for international reaction. So there's nothing to indicate that if the Western world at that time would have said no, that they would have proceeded into Tibet. In fact, they purposely waited till that delegation came back, and then went just 50 miles or so into Tibet. They didn't do a full-scale invasion, just went 50 miles, and again waited almost a year for international reaction. Now, London said, we've left India, we're exhausted by World War II, we left responsibility for Asia with India. When we left there, and it's India's business, and whatever India does, we'll do. And unfortunately, Nehru had this idea that India and China would be the next superpowers, so really, Nehru gave Tibet to China.
Absolutely.
At that late date in its history. And again, he was a lawyer, which goes back to my point of how this middle path approach to Tibetan status is very dubious.
Yeah, I don't know. Jamyang, why don't you guys come and do some questions? Come and join us, and you may have something to say on this. And Elliot, you guys are leaving the burden on us. You're supposed to come here with the nation. What? Oh, okay. So I'm sure you have something to say on that.
Actually, on this issue
No,
of
yeah.
American recognition, generally it's as our friends have pointed out, but I saw a memo from State Department, a copy, I don't remember it clearly, but I have, where they actually discussed, this was during the Cold War, where they actually discussed, they sent a letter to the Canadian, they said, there is a possibility that the question of Tibetan independence could be open. So the thing, I think, is in the end, it's a question of convenience for the country itself at that time. If it benefits America, they'll recognize Tibetan independence. But the problem, at that time, when there were some approaches made to the Tibetan government and to the Dalai Lama, And I think from our side also, a number of mistakes were made.
Yes, that's true.
When His Holiness, the Americans first invited him to the United States, because the invitation wasn't official from the government, His Holiness he didn't know what to do, and he didn't come, and I think that was a big mistake. Whether it was official or not, he should have done to present his case to the United States. Yeah.
Okay.
And that was a mistake. And secondly, I think the mistake was, not following up on these minor discussions that were taking place in the State Department. Petitioning, doing your own lobbying. And we still don't do this. The Tibetans have this feudal attitude of coming with a petition to the United Nations or to a government and asking for submitting this petition. And when it's rejected, then everyone is depressed. Rather than working from grassroots up, just lobbying and this sort of thing hasn't been done very much in the Tibetan context. So even now, when people talk about the fact that independence, the whole case for independence is not feasible, in this day and age. We've tried before and we haven't succeeded. We actually haven't tried that very much. When you look into the history of what the Tibetans did, in exile we did ask the United Nations to do that, and then with different governments, but a huge effort wasn't made. So I think that we've just begun to scratch the surface on this. Okay. That it is possible even to get government, the United States, start with a few senators. I know a few friends of mine, not that close, but who said they will recognize Tibetan independence. At least you're starting from somewhere, and then you can go through this, one by one, and you can work on it. So it's not completely, undoable at all.
So you guys elect a CTA that will love you that way, and we will support it. We will. Depending on what the call is. You do it. You have a lawyer right here. Bobby, from the Shakabpa clan. They know the history. He has it in his blood.
Other questions for the panel? Any of the panelists?
That's all right. It's very simple. I just wonder if it's available someplace to get a statement or a succinct summary of the Dalai Lama's middle path, or Mr. Mullin, should I say, so-called lawyer called
Did you read my book?
I haven't read your book. Is it in it?
It's there.
But which one?
Why the Dalai Lama matters, the second half.
Okay.
It takes from all his different talks, basically, what is the middle way, why it's called the middle way compared to this approach and that approach, and what demands it makes in China and what it offers to China in exchange. I put it over there. There is also a white paper that the negotiating team put together somewhat after that also gives a summary of things, but it doesn't base it on Dalai Lama's specific speeches, which I did in that book. So that's my response to His Holiness saying, you look. Unfortunately, it took me 20 years because of my own priorities. But you can find it there. So let's just take a statement.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Questions? More questions? Comments? Any from in the lab? Any questions from our internet viewers?
There was an incomplete question. The second part is yet to come.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to say something on the middle way while we're waiting. In terms of the Tibetan presentation, they used to be called Tibetan government, the Central Tibetan Administration, they're sort of forced to be called now. It makes sense to a civilized person. It's a beautiful idea that why can't we all learn to just get along? But unfortunately, the Tibetans aren't dealing with that reasonable, logical, or rational people. And don't forget, China in 1989, after Tiananmen Square, arrested and killed 5 million of their own children. That's just in China. The Tiananmen Square was the tip of the iceberg. That happened on every college course.
Number 5 million?
Campus across. The number 5 million was given to me by a CIA fellow, actually, when I was up in Chengdu about a year after. They said 5 million people. It was the CIA.
That's very powerful.
Their own people that they killed.
They also killed a lot of military people who didn't we obey the initial orders to go and crush those, students.
So, you know, when the Dalai Lama puts forth a proposal like this, naturally it's rational, naturally it's beautiful, naturally it's sensible, naturally it all adds up very nicely on paper. But the reality is that they're not dealing with people who work in clear mathematics. What was it Bill Clinton said in the National Democratic Convention? It comes down to arithmetic. So the Chinese, looking at the Dalai Lama's proposal, just think, we don't have to do this. We've already taken Tibet, we own Tibet. Why do we have to be the nice guy? We've got all the guns, we've got the army, we've got it. Possession is 9/10 of the law. And so it sounds nice on paper, and it's a beautiful idea, and it's very rational, but it's not going out to rational people. I think I'll pass it over to Jam Yang, seeing as how he's kind of like the strong guy.
I will speak that. I think that when you say that, it's like the Netanyahu or Ariel Sharon before that. Oh, I can't speak to Arafat because he's not a human being. There's no partner to talk to in Palestine. You know, if you get that, then the only alternative is war, actually. Whether you call it independence or middle way, whatever it is, you're talking war. But in that light, there's something else I had wanted to say in this dialogue, actually, and that is that the Buddhist theory of nonviolence is not simplistic, come and kill me, nonviolence. It is not. There is a Buddhist sutra called the Teaching of Satyaka, and the Satyaka Sutra for short. It has a much longer name that I will not recover right now. We have a publication, the translation of it by Losang Jamspo, the Ladakhi, out in the bookstore there. And in that, there is a theory of just defense. And in that, it does authorize a king, a Buddhist king, to fight off an invader. But it has specific strictures. And one of them is, you can fight an invader if you feel you can successfully defend yourself, and you can expel them from your country. If you're fighting just for honor or something, but you actually, if you're looking at the math, you could not possibly succeed, you shouldn't fight that invader, because by killing some of them before they overrun you, they will be more vicious in their occupation of your country. And then even if you kick them out, you shouldn't pursue them into their country. Once you've done that, you impose a treaty on them that they don't invade again. So, in other words, the concept of Buddhist nonviolence may be different from Gandhian idea, includes the concept of surgical violence. In other words, if you could use violence to minimize a larger violence, you should, and you're supposed to. Bodhisattva is supposed to do that. In a Sangha's book, he says, taking life is bad, but if you prevent someone from taking other lives by doing so, you should. But you should do it, of course, compassionately and blah, 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 without hatred. But, so it makes it hard for someone to do it if they happen to be a normal person. But still, there's even a thing with more normal soldiers, there is an option of using violence and military in Buddhist sutras from the Buddhist's own teaching. So it isn't just a simplistic thing of let's make war or not. And I don't think that we can say out of 1.3 billion Chinese that they're all crazy and they're all insane. Their problem is that they have a gangster government. And this bunch of thugs in the government are, do not follow the will of the Chinese people. I don't think the Chinese people really prefer to have a job in Tibet in the cold up there. They'd rather have a job in their hometown. They don't prefer to have their country polluted by Walmart factories and by Apple computer factories and like poison in their food, poison in their milk, poison in their rivers. They don't want that either. And they are really steaming about their government. There's a lot of resentment. The government, they can kill 5 million. I'm glad to know that figure. I had never known the figure. I know it's a lot of people after Tiananmen, and the kind of students they allow to come out nowadays are very different from the ones that came out before. They're very much cowed and very much like won't listen to anything, a lot of them. But still, there's someone there to talk to. They were Buddhists for thousands of years. They are, in a way, a great people, the Chinese. They have good cooking. As I say, a lot of the Tibetan revolutionary always used to meet to plan things in Chinese restaurants. Very often. And so, I think it's silly to say, and it's the disorder called pessimismitis. Saying that all Chinese are hopeless and you can't be reasonable with them. Then we're talking, that is a possibility. What you're saying is a possibility. If China's some rulers, maintain control of China, with their own people resenting them as strongly as they do, and arresting their Liu Xiaobos, their Charter 208, and this kind of people, the last ditch of such an autocracy or dictatorship is always, now they're using their last ditch because communism doesn't work anymore. Capitalism is highly unequal. They're having billions of dollars and their own people are still poor. And so that's not working. So the one thing that's working is hatred of an enemy, nationalism, virulent nationalism. So they're jousting with the Japanese. The main enemy is the United States, of course. They're going to defeat the United States. But you can only do that up to a point, and then you have to attack that enemy. You have to vent the resentment of the population under you against that enemy. And what you're talking then is World War III. And then, by all means, join up with the, with the anti-computer hacking forces, the nuclear force, etc. Let's go for it. But the problem of that is that would be normally the case. We would have a world war. But the problem now is technology has made a world war unwinnable by anyone. And therefore, there has to be a different solution to this problem, and the only solution is some sort of reasonable dialogue, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls for in all international fora, and sets the example by being willing to dialogue with a government that is committing genocide, not just cultural genocide, actual genocide in Tibet today. And the rest of the world's governments are looking the other way. And still in the middle of that, His Holiness sets the example and says, I'll still talk to them. There are some reasonable people there somewhere, although he did kind of give up on the government. He said